Welcome to the Japan Society of Boston's Poetry Club. Michelle Crowson, an award-winning writer, translator, and scholar of Japanese literature, will be our speaker tonight. Thank you.
And thank you for being here on International Women's Day. In keeping with the theme, we're going to explore a female poet today, particularly a female poet and her poems in some of its multilingual contexts. We typically think, when we think of Japanese poems, we typically think about sound for the most part. The haiku, for example, it's a poem composed of 5-7-5 syllable units, as many of you know, and it's often recited aloud. So translators, and I know there are some of you out there, strive to share this rhythm and brevity with English readers. But two other artistic angles of haiku, which are much less discussed and even more difficult to convey in translation, are the visual and tactile qualities of poems that have been integrated into objects such as scrolls, poem slips, desktops, and teapots. So today I'm going to highlight the work of a remarkable woman poet who worked in the genre of haikai, which we call today haiku. Her name is Kaga no Chiyo, or Chiyo of Kaga Province, modern day Ishikawa Prefecture, for those of you who may have visited Kanazawa. Chiyo was an 18th century merchant class poetess who achieved tremendous success in her own time. And she became second only to Matsuo Basho in fame. He was the poet of the famous Old Pond, Frog Jumps In, Sound of Water poem. Chiyo was active during the post-Basho period, when the entire poetry community was debating over the state of the genre, which some believed had taken a major nosedive after the death of Basho, who was essentially the father of the genre in a literary sense. Next slide, please. Our first Chiyo composition is a haiga, a combination of text and image brushed onto a hanging scroll, which features two commoners who are flying a kite across an expanse of paper, which is full of the implication of wind. The poem reads, Fuke fuke to hana ni yoku nashi, ikanobori. Blow, blow, though it's bad for the blossoms, cuttlefish kites. The vertically calligraphed poem begins in the upper right-hand corner beneath that red seal there, and the characters fuke fuke to, blow, blow, rise in swift gusts as if buffeted by some unseen energy, just like the slender tendrils of the kite, which whip up toward the upper left-hand side. In contrast, on the lower left-hand side, the characters for ikanobori, cuttlefish kites, are thick and steady. Compare those bold, steady lines of cuttlefish kites with the thin, sweeping lines of the character hana, blossoms, so abbreviated it feels as if it might actually blow off the page. Chiyo remarkably evokes the buffeting wind through these tendrils of the kite, the swiftness of the calligraphy, fuke fuke to hana ni yoku nashi. There's also energy in the movement in the figures as they each step a foot forward in tandem, craning their necks back and upward toward the wind-borne kite and away from the dissipating blossoms. And you can see they each have a little foot peeking out in that forward momentum. It's just one of my favorite haiga, and Chiyo was very much admired for her haiga, and I love to share this one. But next slide, please. Some of her most fascinating work, I think, is the work that she created not necessarily for display, but for use, for her many travels within and also beyond her home province of Kaga. Travel was an essential part of poetic community building, and whenever poets traveled, they stopped to visit each other in their homes, exchange poems, participate in linked verse composition parties, and otherwise maintain connections with a wide network of poets. So it wasn't a solitary affair by any means. So this second poem I want to highlight is one she brushed onto the flap of an alms bag she carried with her on her travels after she became a nun, which is in her mid-50s. And that's also when she began her most poetically productive period. The poem is calligraphed vertically in 4 lines from right to left and reads, Meigetsuya, me ni okinagara, to ariki. The full moon, walking far while it rests in my eyes. The full moon is a symbol of autumn and enlightenment, and its reflection is carried in the speaker's eyes as she travels a long distance on a bright fall evening. Just as the poem depicts the speaker traveling beneath the full moon, the poem travels with Chiyo on her journeys on the road, a talisman, a celebration of movement when a woman's ability to travel was very highly constricted. There's an ease and freedom in the poem, which is full of light and motion, subverting the real restrictions placed on her and her fellow female poets of the time. What I love about the poem is that it has no geographic boundaries, no particular destination in mind. Wonderfully aimless, the poetic figure is merely to ariki, walking far, with the moon as her only constant. Notice that it's not her eyes resting on the moon, it's the moon that is resting, a position that brings into focus the image of a slender, ordinary woman walking joyfully with her larger-than-life companions, poetry and the moon. Next slide, please. The next Chiyo poem is also one that she carried on her body during her travels, and it was co-composed along with her dear friend and fellow traveling poet, Iijima Karyo, from Kanazawa. The 2 women traveled together from their neighboring towns in Kaga to the ancient capital of Kyoto, and to commemorate that journey, they each calligraphed a poem onto Chiyo's woven hat, which is pictured here. The first poem is Chiyo's, and the second one is Karyo's. Michi michi no hana o hitome ya Yoshinoyama. All along the road are eyes full of blossoms, Yoshino Mountain. Hino ashi no taranu nagori ya kusa no hana. Too brief, these rays of parting sunlight, flowers in the grass. We can imagine that they composed a pair of poems for Karyo's hat as well, creating a poetic record, one for each of them, commemorating their journey to a place of great cultural significance, which they wore all the way back home to their rural home region. Next slide, please. The final poem I'd like to introduce isn't actually a Chiyo poem, but it's part of a poetic object that Chiyo understood the significance of very well. The object is a writing desk, which belonged to one of Basho's direct disciples, Hokushi. It was common practice in these days for a poetry teacher to hand down to their best disciples a poetically inscribed desk as a symbol of their relationship with each other and poetry as a whole. Pictured here is an example of one such desk. This is one that Chiyo inscribed for her disciple and dear friend Kawai Kempu. The photo on the right is the top of the desk, where you would lay the paper and write, and it's decorated with an image. And the photo on the left is the underbelly of the desk, where Chiyo calligraphed her poem for Kempu. Next slide, please. So it's from this practice that trailing mists, that the trailing mists desk comes from. As the story goes, when Basho was still alive, he inscribed his disciple Hokushi's writing desk with the following poem. Kasumigata no tonae mo oka shikaranka. Isn't there also beauty in the call of trailing mists? After which the desk came to be known as the Trailing Mists desk. It was handed down to several other poets and eventually to Chiyo's friend and disciple, Kempu. And I should note also the desk pictured here is just for reference. It's not the actual Trailing Mists desk, unfortunately. Say that 5 times fast, Trailing Mists desk. Next slide, please. So when Kempu received the desk, he decided to commemorate this honor by editing an anthology of Basho school poetry and naming it Trailing Mists. He sent Chiyo a copy of the manuscript and asked her to write a preface for it, which is a really rare request for a male haikai poet to make of a female haikai poet. But that was her status in this era among her contemporaries. Next slide, please. She responded by writing the following, and this is just an excerpt of a slightly longer preface, but I'm going to read just the excerpt part. This anthology seeks to be a trailing mist in the slender spaces between things. I am honored to accept this collection from the desk of one who is deeply committed to live amongst the blossoms and spend evenings gazing at the moon. From the very beginning into hazy old age, up to the very moment when asked to write this, I have pondered the meaning of this passing life. And so, not minding my shameful view of this earthly world, I step out into a rainy night of croaking frogs and stand, slightly damp, like some kind of nostalgic fool. Chiyo's preface beautifully pays tribute to the occasion and to her friend by referencing him via the poetic object. I am honored to accept this collection from the desk of one who is deeply committed to live amongst the blossoms and spend evenings gazing at the moon. Blossoms and the moon, meaning poetry. But the one who is deeply committed isn't actually just one individual, since the desk is part of a lineage of poetic care. It's a lively community of artists traveling together, collaborating, teaching, arguing, and singing poems together. That liveliness is also figured in the creatures of her final line, when Chiyo steps into a rainy night of croaking frogs and stands slightly damp, like some kind of nostalgic fool. So these are a few objects that I think really show the greater multimedial poetic context of haiku. But next slide, please. Chiyo was primarily a haikai poet. So for you waka fans out there, I want to offer a sneak preview of our next poetry club meeting. We're going to spend some time with a waka poet, specifically the waka poet, potter, and calligrapher Otagaki Rengetsu. And her calligraphy and poetically engraved pottery are pictured on this slide and the following slide. So you get just a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the poetic objects we'll be exploring in May. Yes, very excited to share these ones with you.